Buonasera. Buonasera. Mi è molto piacere avere possibilità invitato a parlare nel cerchio dell'onorabile Società Bibliotheca Hertziana della Città Eterna. Sono grata alla direzione e alla commissione che prende attentamente il mio lavoro e grazie per il vostro aiuto e sostegno del popolo dell'Ucraina.
Dear colleagues, I thank you for the honor of being with you today and having the opportunity to practice your favorite architectural science, to distract from the worries and the great trouble that the war brought to Ukraine. I am grateful for your support for our scientists and for your interest in our art and architecture. History is a continuous transitional period where time flows and every moment contains the past and the future. But the geographical space is also a continuous transition, and every work of art is an interweaving of influences, a carpet of colorful stylistic rays. Each of the rays has its own center of formation and field of propagation. Studying wall architecture for 20 years, getting acquainted with the monuments of Hellenistic Bactria, Indian Chitorka, Spanish Seville or Cairo mosques, I ask myself the question of where the boundaries of style are. In the Jordanian castle of Karak, I remembered provincial Cistercian abbeys and confirmed my opinion about the transparency of the stylistic boundaries. I transferred this question to the material of the history of architecture of Ukraine, defining the relevant scientific problem of the genesis of the style, defining the subject and object, the goal and task of the research, which should lead to a certain result and conclusions.
Архітектура України 17
The architecture of Ukraine in the 17th and 18th centuries is diverse and dialogical, and this dialogue is embedded in the very history of Ukraine. Since the formation of the oldest Proto-Slavic settlements, since the appearance of the ancient Roman and Byzantine cities near which the Kyiv and Rus state was formed in the Middle Ages, such a dialogue has been relevant. Subsequently, the political and cultural influences of Lithuania and Poland, the Golden Horde and Ottoman Turkey spread to Ukraine. And in the 17th and 18th centuries, a national state was formed in Ukraine, which fought for independence and established its own culture and architecture. Thus, it enters into dialogue of traditions and styles of architecture. From the beginning, Kyiv occupied the position of the center on the vertical waterway and the horizontal land route between the walled centers of the Mediterranean, Europe and Asia. Kyiv first received stylistic influences from Byzantium and formed its architectural tradition, passing it on to the other region of Russia. Since then, the history of Ukrainian architecture has focused on the dialogue between folk wooden architecture and professional monumental architecture. Ukraine had constant interventions of styles and simultaneously developed its own architectural tradition. The stylistic intervention of Byzantium led to the formation of the Kievan Rus school of architecture, which in the world context is noticeably original and progressive. Stylistic interventions of European Romanesque, Gothic and Renaissance were local. Ukrainian folk architecture has its roots in the Tripilia and Old Slavic tradition of a three-part dwelling, from which a three-part temple was formed in the 17th and 18th centuries. The forms of the temple are enriched and complicated. The layout has both linear and cross-shaped forms, but a single logic of constructions and compositions. In the Ukrainian folk architecture of the 17th and 18th centuries, unique structures are formed, it is refined and harmonious. In regional schools, the same principles are interpreted in different forms. These principles clearly echo the ideas of the sacred architecture of Kievan Rus. Also, the architecture of Kyiv Rus receives reminiscences in the architecture of the Ukrainian Orthodox Baroque, the forms of which are simultaneously enriched by borrowing details from Catholic architecture. We get a classical dialectical synthesis, where the thesis of local traditions, ancient Kyiv Rus and modern folk traditions, gets the antithesis of European Baroque models built by Catholics in Ukraine. Their synthesis is the Ukrainian Baroque phenomenon. The Catholic architecture of Ukraine is a reference model of the European style. It was first proclaimed by the Jesuits, as in the rest of Europe. Catholic Baroque churches in Ukraine are basilicas and domed basilicas, with a space that develops in depth and a characteristic accent facade. With a classic Baroque order system, the structure and details of such architecture follow the Italian, German, and Czech Baroque models. The authors of the temples are Italians, Germans, Dutch, Poles, who live and work in Poland, Ukraine, Russia. At the same time, the leaders of the Ukrainian Cossacks, the leaders of the troops of Zaporizhia and the left bank, the Hetmans, became patrons of the construction of brick rather than wooden temples, and in brick churches, borrowing, simplification and adaptation of forms of the European Catholic Baroque takes place. At the same time, such temples are dominated by the structure, constructive and compositional solutions characteristic of folk wooden temples. The combination of the Catholic Baroque style and traditional folk forms occurs in architectural ornaments and details, the borrowing of order elements, forms and framing of openings, the solution of pediments, etc. Monumental brick temples sponsored by Cossack leaders are the so-called Ukrainian Cossack Baroque. These temples follow the logic of the development of a linear and cross-shaped plan, a 3-tower and a 5-tower composition. Their spatial solution is vertical, tiered. Such temples are centric and not deep like basilicas. They have a 3-dimensional solution and not a single facade solution as in Catholic basilicas. We have already seen similar principles in the folk wooden churches of Ukraine in the 17th-18th centuries. Such monumental brick churches of the Cossack Baroque are being built in all regions of the left bank and part of the right bank of Ukraine, in Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk region, Donetsk region, Poltava region, Kharkiv region, Sumy region, Chernihiv region, Cherkasy region, Kyiv region, and in Kyiv itself. And each such temple can become an object of study of stylistic synthesis and transparency of stylistic boundaries. Thus, the theoretical scientific model finds practical confirmation and we can draw certain conclusions. Understanding that the style of architecture is a consequence of the style of life and the style of thinking, we see in the Ukrainian Baroque architecture of the 17th and 18th centuries certain variations in form, content and imagery. This is a consequence of the differences in worldview and lifestyle of the creators of such architecture. Catholic Baroque architecture is a benchmark of stylistic forms and imagery, having in them colonial content. At the same time, the Ukrainian folk architecture of the 17th, 18th centuries has original and innovative forms that embody the content of democratic social organization, and the image of such architecture can be conventionally compared with the Renaissance in the sense of humanism, clarity, simplicity, vitality, and idealism. Ukrainian brick Baroque Cossack and Hetman architecture has synergetic forms with the content of the national renaissance and cultural revival, and figuratively is a complex multi-vector phenomenon that embodies the transparency of stylistic boundaries in architecture. Thank you for your attention, and I hope for the continuation of our scientific communication, dialogue and cooperation, because in a short report I was only able to summarize certain provisions and didn't have the opportunity to deeply review the topic and many related issues.